Hello and welcome to a masterclass in Mariology. This is Dr. Mark Miravalle. I am joined by my longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Robert Fastiggi, as we seek to impact some of the marvels, the beauty, and the love of Our Lady. And in this program, which we are going to date purposely, we will discuss the new Holy Father, Pope Leo XIV. Just what his first few days as Pope has meant in terms of a Mariological focus, and as well the great Marian teachings of his namesake and predecessor, Pope Leo XIII. So, Robert, let's start with the name. Let's start, I think most everyone was surprised, except for, I guess, 89 cardinals who voted for him. With the announcement of the first the first American Pope, but also very Marian Pope, as we'll see. We'll talk about his coat of arms and that which has happened in these first couple of days. But let's talk a little bit about the significance of his name choice. So when we hear that he's going back about 120 years to Leo XIII in terms of a predecessing pontiff, what do you think the significance of that is?
Yes, I think it's quite significant. Now, Leo XIV himself has alluded to this in some interviews and said, well, Leo XIII was the great pope of social teaching, social encyclicals, and there were new challenges at the end of the 19th century with industrialization. He stood up for the rights of workers and the poor, the dignity of human beings. And so he said, today we have new challenges with artificial intelligence and so on. So he made that connection, but we think that there's a deeper connection here, the Marian dimension, which is quite remarkable. And you know, they're actually very close in age when they were both raised to the papal office. Leo XIII was in 1878, 68. And now Leo XIV is 69. And people thought Leo XIII, back then they didn't think people would live that long. They said, well, he'll be Pope for a few years. Well, he was Pope till 1903. I mean, he died at 93 years old. So we don't know. God's ways are not our ways, but we could be in store for a long pontificate, and that's why he needs our prayers. And he's a highly intelligent man, missionary experience, and this is quite remarkable because just a few years ago he was a bishop in Chiclayo, Peru, but Pope Francis knew him, and he then called him to be the prefect of the dicastery for bishops, elevated him to the cardinalate, and obviously many cardinals were impressed with him, with his missionary background, his fluency in multiple languages, his background in canon law. So I think they thought he had the personality, but we really owe Pope Francis a thanks for Leo XIV. Unless he had elevated him to these positions, he would not have been under consideration.
Yeah, that's true, Robert. And it's rather remarkable to be a cardinal only a few years and to be elected as the vicar of Christ on earth. And before we move to a topic dear to our heart, and that is the Marian dimension of both Leo XIV and Leo XIII, let's speak a little bit more about Rerum Novarum, because the great social encyclical of Leo XIII was a very courageous encyclical where he is directly taking on and very strongly responding against Marxism and the new atheism and these attacks on the church that's coming forward. And in light of that, Leo XIII is making a statement about the legitimacy of private property, the legitimacy of unions. In fact, major quotes from the first labor unions came out of Rerum Novarum because there were Catholic authors in large part to that, to the beginning and forces to the beginning of the labor union movement as it was back in the 19th century. But he also is very clear about that after that, although there is a right, not an absolute right to private property, of course, it's not like a right to life, but that along with the right for private property, it must be used for the common good.
Mhm.
And he makes a reference that after there's the sustenance and proper propriety, all the rest should be given to the poor. All the rest of our financial means should be given to the poor. So that's a very strong social statement, and it's one that fits entirely with the gospel. And the preferential option to the poor is not just a pope's opinion; that's the perennial teaching of the social teachings of the church. And so he fits that. And as you mentioned, this Holy Father has said, the Industrial Revolution for Leo XIII, but now it's the AI, it's the battle of artificial intelligence and all that could mean. So it's a beautiful parallel. But then he will continue into this Marian significance, and I think it's worthwhile to discuss just the first couple days of the Holy Father. So, for example, Robert, on the day of his election, May 8th, which holds all types of significance, as we both know, it was the feast of the Mediatrix of all Graces for the 1962 Dominican Rite, for several regions, for several religious orders. And so that's extremely significant. And also his reference to Our Lady of Pompei. Perhaps you could talk about that as well.
Well, yes, of course, Our Lady of Pompei is very significant because it's connected with Blessed Bartolo Longo, who was a lawyer and a Satanist, but had a deep conversion. And he thought he was going to be damned because he had given his life over to Satan. But a priest told him, no, if you devote your life to the rosary, that's a sign that you're destined for heaven. So he, took his life work to revitalize the shrine of Our Lady of Pompei and devote it to the rosary. And of course, he's associated with that beautiful line that Mary's intercessory power is omnipotent by grace, omnipotens per gratiam. And Leo XIII also had that confidence, and he was familiar with Bartolo Longo. And so I think that Our Lady of Pompei, but also Our Lady Mediatrix of all Graces, this is significant as well. And even in those communities that are given permission to follow the older liturgical calendar, it's an optional memorial. Mary, there's also Mary of the Sacred Heart is also on May 8th. So I know a priest who celebrates that. I said, no, you should celebrate Mediatrix of all Graces. He says, I alternate year to year. So
that's fair. Well, yeah, and these things are significant. They're providential. It's in the month of Our Lady. It's on this day. And then, very significant, are the first words of Leo XIV. And he starts by making witness to the risen Christ. And then he concludes with his longest kind of subset of his first speech on Our Lady, and talks about how she is our mother, how she wants to walk with us, she loves us, and then alluding to the feast of the supplication of Our Lady of Pompei, but technically it's Our Lady of the Rosary of Pompei, and this immediately connects him with Leo XIII, who was nicknamed the Rosary Pope. And why was he nicknamed the Rosary Pope? Because of 12 separate encyclicals on the Rosary. I mean, Robert, if there were 6 encyclicals, if there were 3 encyclicals on the Rosary, one might say, well, don't you think there's other topics that are important? 12 separate encyclicals on the Pope that would bring us into the 20th century. And so you've got another connection between Leo XIII and Leo XIV and his beautiful reference, and then leading everyone in the praying of the Hail Mary. So it's hard to be more Marian in his very first statement.
Exactly. It's very clear that he has a Marian heart, as did Pope Francis. And that's significant that he went the Saturday, the first, just 2 days after his election, he goes to two Marian shrines, but of course, ending praying at the tomb of Pope Francis at St. Mary Major and putting a rose there. But, you know, about not in addition to the 12 rosary encyclicals, there were also apostolic letters of Leo dedicated to the rosary. So almost like every October during his pontificate, he would come out. Now, some dispute, some say there were 11 because there was this one Quad Auctoritate proclaiming an extraordinary Jubilee year in 1885. But that was he put that Jubilee year under the protection of Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary. So it qualifies. I think 12 is a good number. So
Yeah.
I just thought I would mention that for some listeners who want to dispute. No, it's really 11. No, we could include Quad Auctoritate because the Jubilee year was placed under the protection of Our Lady of the Rosary.
And yes, and again, in these first 4 days of Leo XIV, and then I want to really tap some of the beauty and profundity of the Mariology of Leo XIII, which obviously this Holy Father has to be mindful of, because after, or some would say, along with being known for the social teachings of Leo XIII, is the Marian teachings of Leo the 13th. But you know, even on the second day, Robert, on Friday, May 9th, he gives his homily to the College of Cardinals. Beautiful homily, a spiritual homily. And he says, you know, he's quoting, because it's a commentary in Matthew 6:13-20, as is appropriate for the first Mass of the first Holy Father, a new Holy Father. And so he says, you know, you know, you are the Christ, the Son of living God. He goes on the response of Peter, and he speaks about how the world rejects this in two different ways. One is because he's not rich and powerful and doesn't seek pleasure and sex and the other things that have become really kind of false gods. And even this is happening in Caesarea Philippi, which is a very opulent city at the time. So that's one way to reject Jesus, is he's not big enough in the world. The other is this concept that, well, he's just a charismatic figure, or he's a Superman. And I think this is very important, Robert, that the Holy Father says that even for baptized Christians, those who hold that are practicing a type of practical atheism. Now, those are strong words, but they're absolutely true words. Then he talks about what's required: personal conversion, personal relationship with our Lord. Secondly, missionary activity. And then thirdly, he talks about the proper exercise of authority using the image of none other than Ignatius of Antioch, and talks about martyrdom, and says that proper authority is where the authority makes himself small, but is willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, even to be devoured by the beasts. And then finally ending with a reference to Our Lady as Mother of the Church. I found it extremely profound for his first homily, and entirely on a spiritual, Christocentric Marian note.
Exactly. So already in the first 2 days of his pontificate, we see, you know, Mary, Mother of the Church, which is very important, and then praying the Rosary, and then of course on Saturday, he makes this trip 30 miles outside of Rome to this shrine, elevated to be a basilica in 1903 by none other than Leo XIII, the Basilica of the Mother of Good Counsel. And this was entrusted to the Augustinians. And so he goes in a van there to pray in a special way. But there's this is in Genazzano, Italy, and it was entrusted to the Augustinians. But there's a type of miraculous image there that in the 15th century, when the Turks were taking over Albania and destroying some churches, this image, which originates in Albania, was found by this mystical widow, and then it's venerated in the church, and there have been multiple miracles associated with the Mother of Good Counsel. And Leo XIII, in his last year of his pontificate, added Mother of Good Counsel to the Litany of Loreto. He had already added Queen of the Most Holy Rosary in 1883 to the Litany of Loreto. But we'll have to see what Pope Leo XIV does with the Litany of Loreto. His predecessor, Pope Francis, made 3 editions, but this often tells us a little bit about his devotion there.
Right.
And then just speaking extemporaneously, when he was there in Genazzano, he says, don't forget your mother, entrust yourselves to the mother. And that's very significant. So he's clearly Marian. Maybe you could elaborate on his coat of arms. You had mentioned that.
Yes. And he only made a slight adjustment from his coat of arms as cardinal, but it has really 2 images. One is, half of it is blue. And in fact, it was even more so in the other image, but they had to kind of adjust it because you have to have the keys. It's smaller, but of the 2 images, one is a blue image with the Marian floor on it, indicating, which is also, it's both Marian and French, which also testifies to his French descent on his father's side. But in the other major image is a book with an arrow in a heart on the book. And that's an Augustinian image. The book is scripture, and the heart speaks of one's love of God, and also Augustine's particular love of God, and the arrow that pierces the heart, an expression of that love. So, but half of his image is Marian, half of his coat of arms is Marian. And, when he was outside of that shrine of Our Lady of Good Counsel, as you said, this is spontaneous. It's really part of who he is, both on his coat of arms and in how he speaks extemporaneously. And the crowd started saying, "Viva la Papa." And his response was, "Viva Maria."
Yes.
And so I just find that exceptional. And then we go to Sunday, and we have the Regina Caeli on Sunday, Robert. And again, we get more on Our Lady.
That's right. That's right. And he mentions, as popes often do in their Angelus, after their Angelus address or after the Regina Caeli during Paschal time, places where we need to pray for peace. And he entrusted all these concerns for peace to Our Lady, Queen of Peace, Regina Pacis.
Yes.
So we are Mother of the Church, Mother of Good Counsel, Queen of Peace, and then certainly going there to St. Mary Major, where Mary, there's the image of Mary, Salus Populi Romani. Now, salus is sometimes translated health, but it also could translate salvation. That Mary is, very closely tied to our salvation.
Yes, that's right. And the fact that on his first day off, so to speak, he goes to not 1 but 2 Marian shrines. I think this is really extraordinary, and he obviously has no concern about being associated with the mother, and that's also apart from Mary our mother. Well, that's mother of all. That's spiritual mother of humanity. That's the doctrine. Mary our mother. He repeats this. So for the first 4 days, it's hard to imagine he could do more testimony to his authentic love of Our Lady, both in written forms and also extemporaneous. So perhaps, Robert, we could start talking a little bit more about the Mariology of Leo XIII.
Yeah.
Because yes, it is a time of great upheaval in the church in the late 19th century. You had the history of the political ideology of the French Revolution, which was so attacking on the church. And then you've got the Industrial Revolution, and then you've got both Marxism and atheism and Freemasonry on the rise during that time. But Leo XIII goes to Our Lady. So let's start unpacking some of the specific Mariological teachings of Leo, what he's particularly known for.
Yes, exactly. In terms of his biography, Leo XIII was influenced by some of the Marian events of the 19th century. He was devoted to Our Lady of La Salette, and
Mhm.
even met with Melanie, one of the visionaries of La Salette. That was 1846. And then, of course, Lourdes, he was very devoted to Our Lady of Lourdes, 1858, because, you know, this is all the time when he was a priest. And then also, he was very devoted to St. Louis de Montfort, because if we remember, it was only in 1842 that the discovery of the true devotion to Mary.
Mhm.
And Father Calloway brings this out in this book, The Champions of the Rosary. But he was very devoted to St. Louis de Montfort, who also promoted very strongly the Rosary. So Leo XIII saw some of the challenges. We sometimes forget, we think of atheism as a 20th century phenomenon. No, the roots of it go back even to the 17th century, 18th century, but the 19th century with rationalism. Maybe some were not atheists, but they didn't believe in supernatural revelation, and they were rationalists. And so Leo XIII then saw the importance of Mary, and the Rosary, of overcoming these errors and heresies of the day. And so don't forget, he was the Pope who beatified St. Louis de Montfort.
Right. And it's coming after Pius IX, who was remarkable, he who defined the Immaculate Conception, also encouraged by Rita Bach and the apparitions of the miraculous medal, Our Lady of Grace. So yes, it's really, which kind of begs the question, or points to the fact that why does Our Lady come so many times? Rita Bach, La Salette, Pontmont, Lourdes, and continuing in this role? Well, because this is what's happening to Catholic Europe. It's the greatest attack against religion and against God himself since the time of Jesus. And so the mother's coming strong, and that's why Leo's responding to that. And so, but let's also talk about Leo XIII's teaching on the CoRedemptrix and the co-redemption.
Yes, exactly. He's extremely strong on Mary's advocacy as his great intercessory power, but also he teaches very strongly Mary as co-redemptrix, or her co-redemptive role, and also her role as the mediatrix of all graces. He's extremely strong on both of these. Now, he's the first pope to approve in prayer the invocation of Mary as co-redemptrix. And this, an Italian priest, Father Paolo Ciano, needs to be thanked for this, but he found in the Acta Sancti Sedis, 1885, pages 92 to 93, if we want to get specific, Leo XIII personally approving in an audience, you know, with the secretary of the congregation of relics, and these lauds to Jesus and Mary. And in the Latin, one of the titles is Mundo Redimendo Coadjutrix, the coadjutrix in the redeeming of the world. But in the Italian, it's CoRedemptrice del Mondo, the co-redemptrix of the world. And this is specifically approved in 1885 by Leo XIII. Now, there is one encyclical of his where there is a translation in English. It's even on the Vatican website, where she's referred to as co-redemptress, and that's Iucunda Semper Expectatione, September 8th, 1894. And that's in this book, The Papal Teachings on Our Lady. They use the same translation, but we have to be good scholars and say that in the Latin, it wasn't actually co-redemptrix. It's kind of like a phrase, she who took, in the Rosary, we extol the parts Mary played in the redeeming of humanity.
That's right.
And I checked the Italian as well.
Right.
the Latin and the Italian. That's really what it's saying, but that's the equivalent of CoRedemptrix.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I remember that years back, seeing that in that very book of Our Lady, and it's you wouldn't call it a mistranslation, but it's not a perfect translation because it conveys the doctrine. It just doesn't specifically use the title. But in fact, we do have him approving the title in 1885. And perhaps, Robert, I could read this segment from Ineffabilis Deus that also has this beautiful reference. Well, actually, it's in Iacunda Semper even more strongly. He says, quote, "When Mary offered herself completely to God together with her son in the temple, she was already sharing with him the painful atonement on behalf of the human race. It is certain, therefore, that she suffered in the very depths of her soul with his most bitter sufferings and with his torments. Finally, it was before the eyes of Mary that the divine sacrifice for which she had borne and nurtured the victim was to be finished. We see that there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, who in a miracle of charity, so that she might receive us as her sons, willingly offered him up to divine justice, dying with him in her heart, pierced by the sword of sorrow."
Yeah.
Now that's one of the best 10 papal references of Our Lady's co-redemption in history. I mean, she's offering, she's suffering, she dies in her heart, and it's also fulfillment of Luke 2:35 with the piercing of our heart. So there's no question that that is co-redemptive. And also Leo is clearly known for using the title cooperatrix.
Yes.
Cooperatrix is the same. Operare is to work. So, she who works with the Redeemer. It's that same co-trix formulation that we see in the co-redemptrix term.
Exactly. And in his 1885 or 1895 encyclical Adjutricem Populi, he goes over some of these titles of Mary. He mentions her as Mother of the Church, and then he says that she who was so intimately associated with the mystery of human salvation is just as closely associated with the distribution of the graces which from all time will flow from the redemption. And then he specifically mentions some of her titles. Among her many other titles, we find her hailed as Our Lady, our Mediatrix, the Reparatrix of the whole world, the dispenser of all heavenly gifts. Now, how this is dispensatrix is Mediatrix of all graces, but Reparatrix, that's the equivalent of co-redemptrix.
It absolutely is. And he doesn't even use the prefix co. Some people say, well, you can't call her a redemptrix. Well, Catherine of Siena did. In fact, redemptrix from the 14th to the 17th century, redemptrix was used in the church more often than co-redemptrix.
Yeah.
But the co-redemptrix kind of took the lead towards the 18th century, and I think with a positive reason, because it's stressing the subordination. But reparatrix is one who repairs, and it's a feminine suffix, so it's that same element. I mean, and he will. So, for example, in his reference in Supremi Apostolatus Officio, he will talk about her again as the mediatrix. He says she is the, quote, treasure of our peace with God and dispensatrix of heavenly graces. Goes on, she's the one through whom he has chosen to be the dispenser of all heavenly graces. And just so for a quick explanatory note, when you talk about mediatrix, that can be a general category, or you talk about mediation, which includes both her co-redemption and her distribution of graces. Other ways it's discussed is objective and subjective redemption, that Mary participates in the obtaining of the graces of redemption as the co-redemptrix. Then she has the role to distribute those graces. So, but in common parlance, it's completely legitimate to talk about Mediatrix of all graces as the same as Dispensatrix of all graces. But what's very important is that only follows from her role in the obtaining of the graces. Simply put, she's only Mediatrix because she's first the CoRedemptrix. And without the co-redemption, there's no foundation for her to distribute the graces.
Exactly. It's all there in Leo XIII's encyclicals, which is absolutely clear. And we are aware of some of his encyclicals that clearly affirm Mary as the mediatrix of all graces, but I'd like to highlight the one where he endorses Bernardine of Siena's threefold process of the mediation of grace. And this is in Jucunda Semper 1894. And he says, thus is confirmed the law of merciful mediation of which we have spoken, and which Saint Bernardine of Siena thus expresses: every grace communicated to man has three successive steps. By God, it is communicated to Christ. From Christ, it passes to the Virgin, and from the Virgin, it descends to us. And we, by the very form of the rosary, do linger longest, as it were, by preference upon the last and lowest of these steps, repeating by decades the angelic salutation, so that with greater confidence we may thence attain to the higher degrees, that is, may rise by means of Christ to the Divine Father.
Robert, I can only think, we've talked about this several times before, but, the great challenge by theologians, particularly German and Austrian, before the council and even during the council, as Laurie Olson's excellent book, manifests, on saying, well, we don't know how she, has a role of mediation with the graces of the sacraments. Well, Bernardine takes care of that, because the graces come from God to Christ, from the Father to Christ, Christ to Mary, then Mary to the church. Right. So where's the challenge? There's Ronner oftentimes would make this reference concerning Trent, that the graces have to automatically communicate grace, but that was to correct Luther's error, saying that you needed faith. So, for example, the baby baptized couldn't receive that grace because he didn't have personal faith. So Trent was correcting that error. But all the graces, first of all, as the co-redemptrix, she has a role in obtaining all the graces, always second subordinate to Jesus. And then all the graces come from her to the church, and that includes priests and the administration of the sacraments through priesthood. So it's really clearly in Bernardine.
Exactly. And the fathers of Vatican II certainly were familiar with the Denzinger compendium, and the Denzinger compendium that they were familiar with contains two remarkable references of Leo XIII, of Mary's universal mediation of grace. And the one, this is now in 3274 in Denzinger Hühnermann, which is the same as Denzinger Schönmetzer, but this is in Octobri Mensae 1891. And then, first of all, Leo affirms what St. Thomas Aquinas said, that through the Annunciation, the consent of the Virgin in place of all human nature was awaited. So she said yes on behalf of all human nature. And then consequently, he says, it may be affirmed with no less truth and justice that absolutely nothing from this immense treasury of all the graces brought forth by the Lord, inasmuch as grace and truth have come from Jesus Christ, is imparted to us by the will of God, except through Mary.
Yeah. What could be more definitive? Yeah.
Yes.
And it ends with, Mary is our glorious intermediary. She is the powerful mother of the omnipotent God. So he makes it so utterly clear that there's no grace, not a single grace of the redemption, that does not come to us through Our Lady, which is a little bit mindful, Robert, of the recent DDF statement, which caused a lot of concern and confusion about a reference in the commentary on the Rosa Mystica saying that, only God mediates grace. Not even the Virgin herself has a role in the mediation of grace. And you had an outstanding response to that, which you sent on to Rome. But it seems to be a difference between a confusion between mediation and origin.
Yes, origin and the action of grace, but a priest in celebrating the sacraments, he mediates grace, but the grace is God's action, but he mediates the grace. So the Blessed Mother, as affirmed, not just in offhand homilies or general audiences, as some say about CoRedemptrix used by John.
Marginal texts.
Marginal texts. These are in major encyclicals.
Repeated 5 major encyclicals, including Leo's Octobri Mensae, says absolutely nothing. I mean, I don't know what more certainty someone who obeys the church would want than the statement of Leo XIII. Absolutely nothing comes to us of the graces except through Our Lady. That's Mediatrix of all graces. So one wonders, what the DDF and we hope for a clarification. But indeed, that was materially, it was something that ran contrary to 5 encyclicals and 13 individual papal teachings to say that all the graces do not come through Mary. So, we pray that some of this from some of Leo XIII's rich teaching can be an aid to this. And there's still other, plurals of the Mariology of Leo XIII.
Exactly. And in his encyclical of 1896, Fidentum Piumque, he talks about Mary as the Mediatrix of Grace, but specifically links it to her work in the mystery of salvation. So he says, for no single individual can even be imagined who has ever contributed or ever will contribute so much towards reconciling man with God. And he's referring to the Blessed Virgin Mary. She offered to mankind, hastening to eternal ruin, a Savior. At that moment when she received the announcement of the mystery of peace brought to this earth by the angel, and with that admirable act of consent, in the name of the whole human race, she it is of whom Jesus was born. She is therefore truly his mother, and for this reason, for this cause, or ad eum causam, for this reason, a worthy and most acceptable mediatrix to the mediator.
It's just refreshing, Robert, because there's no compromise. It's completely true, and there's no hedging. And it seems like, to some degree, and again, this is not a judgment of hearts. It's just it's a judgment of fact of Mariology since the council, save for people like St. John Paul II, master of all masters of papal theologians in terms of Our Lady, I would maintain. There's still an ongoing minimalizing of the role of Our Lady. I think it's predominantly based on ecumenical concerns, but it's a false ecumenism. What the council called false Irenicism, and what John Paul II said is unthinkable that one would compromise truth for the sake of unity, which he says in Ut Unum Sint. And so it's so refreshing to read these statements of Leo XIII, and really so encouraging to hear about the first days of Leo XIV.
Exactly. And Leo XIII also saw Mary as the great mother of unity, and that devotion to Mary would help overcome heresies, especially reciting the rosary, but bring back the separated brethren into full communion with the Holy Catholic Church. This was always his hope. So rather than seeing Mary as an obstacle, Mary is really the means of ecumenism, of authentic ecumenism. But I was disturbed or shocked when you mentioned about one Dominican Mariologist you spoke to when you were discussing Marian mediation. And what was the question he asked you? Do you really?
No, it was rather remarkable. And he was a well-known national Mariologist. His name is not important for respect for his now, God willing, his soul. And But he came from Washington, D.C., and he met me at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and he said, I'm just checking to make sure that you have an accurate idea of Our Lady's mediation. He said, certainly Mary mediated Jesus at the incarnation, but do you think she still is mediating now? And I found it, Robert, just such a shocking. And immediately I said, Father, did you offer Mass this morning? And he said, yes. I said, well, weren't you a mediator? Did you give out Holy Communion to anyone? Well, yeah, certainly. Well, if you can be a mediator in the New Testament disposition, cannot the Mediatrix of all grace continue after Christ? And Robert, it's so in one experience conveyed this post-conciliar error that Our Lady is not distributing graces now. It was all 2,000 years ago. That was it. She gave us Jesus, and that's it. That's where it stopped. And this was a major national Mariologist. And so that's certainly stuff that Leo the 13th, and God willing, Leo the 14th, will stay clear of, and certainly can go in a forward direction about keeping the hermeneutics of continuity. In my mind, that was Pope Benedict's greatest contribution, is understanding and articulating the hermeneutics of continuity, that there's not a rift between pre-council and post-council. Of course, there's development. Of course, the Spirit was active in Vatican II and in the post-conciliar magisterium. But to deny doctrines from before the council is absolutely verboten. You can't do this. And statements like that, Mariologists, and some of the statements that we hear today in some individuals who refer to themselves as Mariologists, still seem to have that type of fundamental rejection of perennial Catholic truth about Our Lady.
Exactly. And we have to be grateful for John Paul II, St. John Paul II, who referred to Mary as Mediatrix of all graces, or at least in equivalent terms, at least 9 times. He referred to her as CoRedemptress explicitly 6 times, and implicitly at least another 7 for a 7th. And Benedict XVI and Pope Francis shied away from the title CoRedemptrix, but both of them explicitly used at least once during their pontificates Mary as Mediatrix of all grace.
And so let us pray. And I have to tell you, Robert, I'm already getting responses from people all over the world with the election of Leo XIV, the fact that they are immediately sending petitions to our new Holy Father for a solemn definition, for clarity, for a greater appreciation of Our Lady as the spiritual mother of all peoples, but inclusive of her roles in co-redemption, mediation, and advocacy. And so that's very exciting. I just got an email from an American woman today saying, I'm going over to Rome tomorrow for the Jubilee. Can I hand the Pope my letter? So, well, that probably won't be possible, but you can certainly give it, to the Swiss Guards and on the bronze doors, and they can bring it to the Secretary of State, and that's the usual process. But there is a new enthusiasm. And again, no one has a crystal ball. I think it's a call of fidelity, not success. Ultimately, we do this because we love Our Lady. But how beautiful it would be, and I could say this, it would not be outside of the precedence of Leo XIII for Leo XIV to teach with greater clarity Our Lady's co-redemptive role, her role as co-redemptrix, mediatrix of all graces, advocate, spiritual maternity, and even the possibility of a solemn definition. That, of course, is between Our Lady and him, but I think it's our responsibility to let him know it's something we would certainly like, and hence the role of petitions, which were so prominent in what led up to the definition of the Immaculate Conception in 1854, and the definition of the Assumption in 1950. Both popes, respectfully, Pius IX and Pius XII, thanking the people for their petitions, because it gives the Pope an idea of the sensus fidelium.
Exactly. And to understand at least that Mary's mediation is more than just simply her intercession, like all of us intercede on behalf of of our loved ones and the faithful, and for the church. But Mary is mother of the church, and here we have Leo XIII affirming very clearly that by God's will, all graces merited by Jesus come to us through the mediation of his mother.
And in fact, with his references, like the one we referred to about how, she offered him up to divine justice, that she has a co-redemptive role. That's the foundation of her mediation. And again, making reference to her as reparatrix, co-redemptrix, cooperatrix, and approving the first prayer of co-redemptrix. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to not say that Leo XIII clearly and explicitly taught Marian co-redemption, which then became the foundation of her mediation and her advocacy.
Exactly. So we have this great Leo XIII, remarkably Marian Pope, who taught all of these doctrines and affirmed the titles. I mean, even if there's that one where it was not mistranslated, but translated CoRedemptress in English, but he affirms in clear Italian a prayer, 1885, referring to Mary as Corredentrice del mondo, co-redemptrix of the world. There's no other way you could translate that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think we have a lot to be excited for and encouraged by. As always, we respect his papal authority, but as children in love with the Father, we can also manifest respectfully always our desire that this become a solemn definition according to God's perfect plan. People are writing to Pope Leo already, and they can, there's it looks like initially he's going to experiment with Casa Santa Marta in following the line of Pope Francis, whether he stays there or whether he moves to the Apostolic Palace. Still, if you write to Pope Leo XIV, 00120 Vatican City State, they'll know who you're writing to, and it will at least get to the department that deals with the Holy Father's mail. But I think it would be perfect during this Jubilee year for people to write that petition in total respect of the Holy Father, but also asking him to follow the precedents of Leo XIII, someone dear to his heart.
Exactly. And the prayer is so important. He strikes me, Leo XIV, as someone who listens carefully. He doesn't, Pope Francis was he was very Marian. I think he taught Marian co-redemption, but he didn't like being pressured for a new dogma. So he's, that one homily when they say you got to define this or that, let's not get lost in foolishness. But it was clearly on his mind. And
I think it was a bit of a burr under his papal saddle in some ways. But again, we take all that was good from Pope Francis and the great positive elements that came in. But I think based solely on his choice of Leo XIV and his references, let alone the rather providential indications, not to be exaggerated, but not to be ignored, of May 8th, of Leo XIII, of the Rosary Pope, of the reference to Blessed Bartolo Longo and Our Lady of Pompei, and being elected on the Feast of the Mediatrix of all Graces for those who are still celebrating it. I think those are all positive signs. So anyway, thank you, Robert. I think this is very helpful for people to understand why so many people are excited about the first opening days of Leo XIV, but also the remarkable precedence of Leo XIII, and that he's chosen very clearly to follow this in very strong ways. And let us pray, and we can certainly pray, and we can certainly petition that he will finish that which started by Cardinal Mercier back in 1915, a movement for a fifth Marian dogma. So anyway, thank you, Robert, as always. Thank you so much for being with us, and we will continue in a masterclass in Mariology to bring forward subjects regarding the truth and love of our sweet Mother Mary. God bless you all.